In the heart of the bustling city, tourists from all around the world gathered to witness the stoic display of the royal guards. Dressed in their traditional red tunics and tall black fur hats, the guards stood like statues outside the historical palace. It was a clear, sunny day, and the crowd buzzed with excitement, cameras ready to capture the iconic scene. Among the guards was James, a young guard whose impeccable discipline and calm demeanor made him a perfect fit for this prestigious role. James had always been fascinated by the traditions and history of his country, and serving as a royal guard was a dream come true. He stood motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, embodying the silence and strength that had been passed down through generations of guards. As the crowd watched in silent respect, a man, who appeared visibly agitated, pushed his way through the tourists. His face was scrunched in anger, and he muttered under his breath. Unlike the awe-struck tourists, this man, named Derek, seemed to carry a deep-seated disdain. Clad in casual attire, he looked out of place among the tourists who were mostly there to admire and respect the guards' dedication. Derek stopped a few feet away from James and started hurling insults. His words were harsh, filled with racial undertones aimed directly at James. The guard, however, remained unmoved, trained to face adversity without a flinch. This reaction, or lack thereof, only fueled Derek's anger more. He seemed determined to break James's composure, to force him into making a mistake. The tourists began to notice Derek's loud, harsh words. A wave of discomfort spread through the crowd, but everyone's attention was now divided between the historical allure of the guards and the unfolding drama. Parents covered their children's ears, trying to shield them from Derek's offensive language, while others whispered and shook their heads in disapproval. Meanwhile, James stood resolute. Inside, he was trained not to react, to maintain his poise and dignity no matter what. It wasn't just about following orders. It was about upholding the pride of his role, the history it carried, and the respect it commanded. Each insult from Derek bounced off James like pebbles thrown against a fortress wall, heard but not affecting. The confrontation was turning into a spectacle that no one had anticipated when they set out to visit the site that day. James, amidst the storm of words, remained a silent testament to the discipline and resilience that the royal guards were renowned for. His ability to keep calm under pressure was not just a part of his job. It was a profound display of strength and character, capturing the true essence of the duty he performed each day under the gaze of the public and history alike. As Derek continued his tirade against James, the young guard's thoughts drifted to his training, which had prepared him for precisely this type of challenge. Despite the harsh words aimed at him, James found a quiet center within himself, a place of peace and discipline fostered by countless hours of practice and mental preparation. On the other side, Derek seemed to grow more agitated with each passing moment that failed to elicit a response from James. His face red with frustration, he searched for new ways to provoke the unflappable guard. Observers could see the stark contrast between the two, one a picture of composure and duty, the other a display of unwarranted aggression and disrespect. The situation escalated when Derek, feeling ignored and wanting to make an impact, reached down and unleashed his large, muscular dog. The dog, a German shepherd, was initially confused, looking up at his owner with uncertainty. Derek pointed aggressively towards James, commanding the dog to advance. The crowd gasped as the dog took tentative steps towards James. The air was tense with anticipation and worry. Everyone wondered how James would handle this new threat without breaking his stance. Parents pulled their children closer, and several tourists raised their phones, ready to capture the moment. Despite the growing pressure, James remained a statue. His eyes, hidden beneath the rim of his tall fur hat, watched the approaching dog with careful calmness. He understood the animal was not to blame. It was merely following its owner's misguided commands. The dog, sensing no fear or aggression from James, slowed down, its ears perking up in curiosity rather than hostility. The animal circled around James once, sniffing cautiously but finding no reason to attack. It looked back towards Derek, confused by the lack of confrontation. Meanwhile, Derek shouted commands from a distance, urging the dog to act. But the bond of training and discipline between James and the dog seemed to form an invisible barrier. James knew how to stand his ground, not just against humans, but also animals, his presence commanding respect without a word or a movement. As the seconds ticked by, the crowd's initial shock turned to admiration. They began to understand the depth of James's training and the strength of his character. Even in the face of potential harm, he demonstrated an incredible level of self-control and respect for all living beings, characteristics that were deeply ingrained in his duties as a royal guard. Derek's plan had backfired. Instead of showcasing a flaw in the guard's armor, he had highlighted the guard's exceptional discipline and the dignity of his role. The scene unfolding before the tourists was no longer just a guard standing post, but a testament to human grace under pressure, a real-life lesson in patience and resilience. Derek's frustration grew as he watched his dog hesitate in front of James. He had expected the animal to lunge, to create chaos, to finally break the royal guard's legendary composure. But instead, his dog stood still, ears twitching, eyes fixed on James with uncertainty. The tourists, who had initially gasped in fear, were now watching with growing curiosity. Some whispered among themselves, others held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. James, still as a statue, understood exactly what was happening. Animals were sensitive to energy and intention. He had learned long ago that fear, anger, or aggression could trigger unwanted reactions in animals. But he exuded none of those emotions. He remained calm, his presence steady and unwavering. The dog, sensing no threat from him, refused to act out. Derek, growing more impatient, shouted louder. He stomped his foot, trying to provoke both the dog and the guard. The dog flinched slightly at the noise but still didn't attack. Instead, it let out a soft whine and took a step back, tail lowering in confusion. It was as if the animal itself understood that the man standing before it was not an enemy. The crowd started murmuring. A few chuckled at Derek's growing embarrassment. Others were amazed at how James, without lifting a hand or saying a word, had complete control over the situation. Some even began recording, realizing they were witnessing something remarkable. Derek clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. He had set this up as a challenge, a moment where he could expose weakness. Yet he was the only one looking foolish. His dog, loyal but unwilling to act against someone so composed, had chosen to ignore his commands. People in the crowd exchanged knowing glances. It was clear now who held true strength. James, however, did not see this as a victory. He was simply doing his duty. His silence was not defiance, but discipline. His stillness was not weakness, but control. Even in the face of provocation, he remained the embodiment of professionalism, standing tall, representing a tradition that had stood the test of time. As the realization set in, Derek's face twisted in frustration. He grabbed his dog's leash, yanking it roughly, but the dog resisted, looking up at him with uncertainty. It was as if even the animal had lost respect for him. The moment stretched longer, and the energy in the air shifted. What had started as an attempt to shame a royal guard had turned into a public lesson in grace, patience, and the undeniable power of a composed mind. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and Derek, sensing that he had lost the battle he had started, took a step back. But it was not over yet. The guard had held his ground. The dog had refused to attack. But the question remained, what would happen next? Derek stood frozen, gripping the leash tightly, his frustration evident in the way his fingers curled around the worn fabric. His plan had failed. His dog, loyal and well-trained, had not acted as he expected. Instead of attacking the royal guard, the animal had hesitated, sensing something Derek could not: calm, control, and unwavering strength. James remained motionless, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his expression unreadable. He had faced many distractions during his time as a royal guard, but this was different. Most people who attempted to provoke him eventually gave up, defeated by his silence. But Derek was not like most people. He was determined to break the guard's legendary discipline. The tourists around them began to react more openly. Some whispered in admiration at James's ability to remain so still under pressure. Others shook their heads at Derek's behavior. A few chuckled softly, amused by the way the situation had unfolded. What had started as an attempt to embarrass the royal guard had turned into a display of quiet dignity. Derek's dog, still standing between him and James, let out a low whine. It was clear the animal was unsure of what to do. It had been given a command but sensed that the guard was not a threat. Instead of baring its teeth or growling, the dog cautiously approached James, sniffing at the hem of his red uniform. The crowd gasped, expecting some kind of reaction. But James did not move. He did not flinch. He did not look down. He simply remained as he was, as if he had not even noticed the large dog now inches away from him. What happened next left everyone speechless. The dog, after a few moments of hesitation, sat down at James's feet. It let out a soft exhale, its ears relaxing. Instead of attacking, it seemed to acknowledge James as the one in control of the situation. It was an incredible sight. A dog, trained to follow its master's command, had chosen to submit to the unshakable presence of the royal guard. Derek's face burned with embarrassment. His own pet had defied him, choosing to obey an unspoken authority rather than his shouted commands. He tugged on the leash, trying to get the dog to move, but it refused, staying seated, as if waiting for permission from James instead. The tourists, who had been silent just moments ago, erupted into whispers and murmurs. Some clapped softly. Others shook their heads at Derek's poor attempt to humiliate the guard. Someone nearby muttered, "That's real discipline." Derek, realizing he was losing whatever control he thought he had, pulled the leash harder, finally getting the dog to stand. He glared at James one last time, but it was clear he had lost. His frustration was replaced by the realization that nothing he had done had shaken the royal guard's composure. As he turned to leave, the tourists continued watching James, their admiration growing. He had won this battle without saying a single word. Derek's grip on the leash tightened as he yanked his dog back, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had come here expecting to humiliate the royal guard, to force him into a reaction, to break the very discipline that made these guards famous. Instead, he had only embarrassed himself. His own dog had refused his orders, and in the most unexpected twist, had sat obediently at the feet of the very man he was meant to intimidate. The crowd watched in stunned silence, a mixture of awe and quiet amusement filling the air. Tourists whispered to each other, some shaking their heads at Derek's behavior, while others exchanged knowing smiles. Phones were lifted, capturing the moment. It was a rare sight to see, not just a royal guard maintaining his legendary stillness, but a man so desperate for attention that he had resorted to something so absurd, only for it to backfire spectacularly. James remained unmoved, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his face an unreadable mask of discipline. He had encountered many distractions in his time as a guard. Tourists making faces, people shouting, even the occasional prank. But this was something new. And yet, just like every other challenge, he had faced it with the same unwavering professionalism. The dog, still reluctant to leave, turned its head toward James once more before Derek gave the leash another firm pull. With a deep sigh, the animal finally obeyed, trotting back to its owner, but not before giving one last glance at the silent, statuesque figure of the guard. It was as if the dog, too, had recognized something in James, something even its own owner had failed to see. The tension that had filled the air moments before began to shift. The crowd no longer felt afraid. Instead, there was admiration, respect, and even a sense of poetic justice in what had just happened. A few people clapped softly, more in recognition of James's restraint than in celebration of Derek's failure. Derek, however, was not ready to admit defeat. He glanced around at the crowd, his face twisting with frustration. He had wanted to humiliate the guard, but now he was the one who had been humiliated. The more he stood there, the more he realized that he had become the spectacle, not James. The tourists weren't laughing at the royal guard. They were laughing at him. His pride wounded, Derek muttered something under his breath, then turned sharply, dragging his dog along with him. The crowd watched as he disappeared into the sea of tourists, his presence fading like a bad memory. Even after he was gone, the people remained, still staring at James, as if trying to understand how a man could remain so strong, so unshaken in the face of such provocation. James, of course, did not react. He simply continued his duty, standing as he always had, silent, disciplined, and unwavering, as though nothing had happened at all. As Derek disappeared into the crowd, the tension that had filled the air moments before slowly began to dissolve. The tourists, still standing in small groups, whispered among themselves, their voices a mixture of admiration and amazement. What had just happened was something they had never expected to witness. A royal guard was supposed to be an unshakable figure, but today, James had proven that their strength went beyond just standing still. He had not only endured the insults and taunts with complete composure, but he had also controlled the situation without saying a single word. Even an animal, trained to follow its master, had chosen to obey his silent authority rather than the harsh commands of its owner. A woman in the crowd nudged her friend. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "He didn't even flinch. And the dog, it just sat there like he was its true owner." "It's unbelievable," another tourist replied, shaking his head in admiration. "That guy was trying so hard to get a reaction, but the guard never broke. That's real discipline." The small murmurs of the crowd soon turned into scattered applause. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it carried a deep sense of respect. People weren't just impressed by James's professionalism, they were inspired by it. His ability to remain calm under pressure was something few people could do, and it showed an incredible strength that went beyond physical ability. James, of course, remained still. He had been trained for this exact scenario. No matter what happened, no matter what people said or did, he was not to react. His job was not to entertain or to fight back. His job was to stand, to uphold a tradition that had existed for generations. And so, even as the applause rippled through the crowd, even as tourists gave him nods of respect, he remained just as he had been from the beginning, motionless, expressionless, and completely in control. But nearby, a pair of security officers who had been monitoring the situation stepped forward. They had witnessed everything. The way Derek had tried to provoke the guard, the way he had unleashed his dog, and the way James had handled it all without breaking the rules. One of the officers, a tall man with a firm expression, approached James and gave him a respectful nod. "That was impressive," he said quietly, though he knew the guard wouldn't respond. "We'll be reporting what happened. You handled that better than most would." The officer then turned to the crowd, making sure Derek was truly gone before signaling his partner. They spoke briefly, making plans to ensure that such incidents wouldn't happen again. Meanwhile, the tourists who had witnessed the scene slowly began to move on, though the memory of what they had just seen would stay with them. As the day went on, more visitors arrived, taking photos, watching the changing of the guard, and admiring the discipline of the royal guards. But for those who had been there earlier, James was no longer just a royal guard. He was a quiet symbol of strength, patience, and the power of true discipline. News of the incident spread quickly among the tourists. Many who had witnessed it firsthand shared their experience with others, while those who had missed it listened in amazement. Some even showed the video recordings they had taken, replaying the moment when Derek's dog, instead of attacking, had obediently sat in front of James. One particular clip captured the entire event clearly. It showed Derek shouting, the dog hesitating, and then the powerful moment when it chose to sit rather than follow its owner's aggressive commands. The video didn't just highlight James's discipline. It showed the contrast between anger and control, between impatience and true strength. Within hours, the video was uploaded to social media, and people began reacting to it. Comments flooded in, with viewers expressing their admiration for the guard. Unbelievable. This is true discipline. That guard deserves a medal. He didn't even blink. I love how the dog knew who the real leader was. As the video continued to gain attention online, people from different parts of the world began discussing it. Some saw it as an example of patience and self-control, while others appreciated the deeper lesson: how true strength isn't about reacting to provocation, but about knowing when not to react. Back at the palace, James remained completely unaware of the growing attention. He continued his duty as usual, standing guard with the same level of discipline and focus. The day carried on, and more tourists arrived, some of whom had seen the viral video, and now looked at James with a newfound sense of admiration. One family approached quietly, standing a few feet away from James. A little boy, no older than 7, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is that the guard from the video?" he asked in an excited whisper. The mother nodded with a smile. "Yes, that's him." The boy looked up at James in awe. To him, this man wasn't just a soldier in a uniform. He was a hero, someone who had shown what real strength looked like. Meanwhile, the palace officials and security staff had also become aware of the video. Some of them watched it with pride, knowing that one of their own had represented the guard's tradition in such an honorable way. Higher-ranking officials discussed the situation, considering whether to issue an official statement or commend James privately for how he handled the situation. But for James, none of this mattered. He wasn't looking for recognition or praise. He had simply done what he had been trained to do: remain still, remain calm, and never let anything break his focus. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the palace grounds, James continued his watch. The day had been eventful, and though he remained unaware of the growing attention, one thing was clear: his unwavering discipline had left a lasting impact on everyone who had witnessed it. As the day drew to a close, the palace grounds quieted down, and the final tourists began to make their way home. The crowds had dispersed, and the soft hum of evening set in, with only the distant sound of footsteps echoing through the stone walkways. But for James, the royal guard, it was just another shift. He had performed his duty without a single slip, without any external recognition. Back at the edge of the courtyard, a small group of tourists lingered, still talking excitedly about what they had seen earlier in the day. They didn't know the guard by name, but they had witnessed something extraordinary. The image of James, standing tall and composed while the situation had spiraled around him, had etched itself into their minds. For them, he wasn't just another soldier in a uniform. He was the embodiment of calm, patience, and strength in the face of adversity. A young couple walked by, the woman pointing out the spot where the incident had taken place. "That's where it happened," she said. "I'll never forget how he stood there without flinching. It was like he knew exactly what to do, like nothing could shake him." Her companion nodded, still processing the event. "I've never seen anything like it. That guard, he didn't let anything get to him, not even that guy and his dog." Others, having watched the footage online, shared similar sentiments. "I think that's what makes him different," one of the tourists said. "It's not just about the uniform or the position. It's about the control. The strength to stay calm when everything around you is trying to make you react." James, still standing at his post, remained unaware of the impact he had had on so many people. His training had taught him to focus on the task at hand, to ignore everything else. He didn't need praise, recognition, or applause. What mattered most to him was the integrity of his role and the respect he had for the tradition he upheld. However, as the evening shadows lengthened, a small group of higher-ranking officials approached. They had heard the stories, seen the footage, and felt it was important to acknowledge James's unwavering discipline. The officer who had spoken to him earlier in the day, now accompanied by his colleagues, stepped forward with a smile. "You did well today, James," the officer said, his tone respectful but warm. "Not just for the job you did, but for the example you set." James nodded, his expression still composed but with a faint recognition in his eyes. He wasn't looking for anything more than the opportunity to serve, but it was clear his actions had made a difference. The officers offered him a small token of appreciation, a formal acknowledgement of his professionalism and dedication. James accepted it with grace, as he always did. He didn't speak much, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. But as the night wore on, and he stood in his usual position, a quiet sense of satisfaction settled over him. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about knowing that he had done his duty to the best of his ability, and in doing so, had shown others what true strength and discipline looked like. As the moon rose high in the sky, casting its soft light across the palace courtyard, James remained in his post, just as he always had, silent, still, and unwavering. His role was simple, but in that simplicity, he had shown the world something extraordinary, and that, he knew, was enough.